Welcome to the Enchanted Library, where we turn the pages of books, beautiful and old, living and magical. It's time to curl up, get cozy, and join us on an adventure. Today we're reading from Lions in the Barn by Virginia Frances Voight. Chapter 3, Barn Menagerie. 4 big cages on wheels were ranged about the walls of the barn. In the one nearest the door, a huge black and gold tiger was slouching restlessly to and fro. At the sight of the strange folks, his striped face curled into a snarl. He roared again, and the roof of the old barn seemed to quiver at the sound. "Land sakes," Ma cried nervously. Clay stepped as close to the cage as he could dare, but it was still a respectful distance away. Emily peeked out from behind him. As the tiger paced back and forth in the cage, the gaudy stripes of his coat seemed to flow along in a kind of rhythm. He was beautiful to look at, yet terrible too. "He looks as though he'd like to eat us," Clay said, staring at the tiger's sharp teeth as the great cat opened his mouth to let out another roar. "Sultan is always restless in new quarters," Joe said. "He'll soon settle down." In the next cage, a pair of spotted leopard kittens huddled together and greeted their visitors with baby snarls and growls. Their eyes gleamed in their saucy whiskered faces. "My, but they're pretty," Emily murmured. She stepped closer to get a better view of the chubby kittens. One of the leopards flashed to the bars and swung at her long braids with his claws, just missing her. Pa grabbed her and pulled her away from the cage. "Don't ever get close enough for the animals to reach you through the bars." After that, Ma kept a tight hold on Emily's dress. "You can't pet these jungle cats like you do Tilly," Clay warned. But he didn't blame Emily for wanting to. The leopard kittens were the prettiest animal babies he had ever seen. The vivid spots in their golden coats looked like black rosettes. The third cage was a double one. On one side was Queen, a tawny, velvet-coated lioness with bright amber-colored eyes. Her cage mate was Jupiter, a lordly, black-maned lion. Joe had an affectionate word for each of these lions. "They are the first cats I ever trained," he exclaimed. The last cage held a lion cub, who stood pressing his broad nose against the bars as he watched the visitors with eager curiosity. Joe looked at him fondly. "This is Chaka, the prince of the lot." Chaka still wore the rough, honey-colored coat of babyhood. He wasn't much larger than a medium-sized dog, but his short legs were stouter than those of any dog. His paws were huge. They looked much too large for the rest of him, and made him seem in continual danger of falling over himself as he bumbled about the cage like a small boy showing off. "Meow, Chaka," Joe said softly. Chaka liked this sort of cat talk. He rubbed against the cage bars, purring loudly, and appeared pleased when Joe reached in a hand to scratch at the base of his ears. "I'm going to train him this winter," Joe told the Baldwins. "Chaka," Clay looked admiringly at the cub. "It's a strange name, but it sounds right for him." "I got the name from a man who hunted the veldt in Southeast Africa on purpose to catch lions for the circus," Joe said, squatting down on an old milking stool to rest. "The Zulu tribe is boss of those parts, and their greatest king was called Chaka the lion. Well, look at the bony structure under this cub's baby roundness. You can tell that someday he'll grow up to be a lion king. So I named him Chaka, after the king of the Zulus." 2 long wooden poles were leaning against the wall in the corner of the shed. "When I am training my cats or performing with them in the big top, 2 circus men always stand by with these poles," Joe explained to Pa. "I'm wondering if you and Clay would do the same while I'm working in the cages this winter." "Excuse us if you're going to talk about work now," said Ma. "Emily and I have to do ours in the kitchen." As they left, Clay picked up one of the poles to heft it. It was tough ash wood, but it didn't seem much of a weapon to use against a lion or tiger. He glanced at his father questioningly. "We'll be glad to help," Pa said, "but with nothing but wooden poles in our hands, we couldn't be much good to you if the lions or tigers should attack while you're in the cage." "I don't expect my cats to jump me," Joe replied. "I've always used kindness and rewards to train them. But cats are nervous, uncertain critters. Every one of 'em has had a bad day once in a while. The idea is for you to push the poles between them and me, in case I ever have to make a quick getaway from the cage. Don't ever jab them with the poles. It would only make them wilder than ever." "Naturally," said Pa. He and Clay nodded to each other in agreement with Joe, for they remembered difficult times they had had in training some of the farm animals. And yet, working with a frisky colt or teaching a pair of calves to pull together under a yoke was hardly the same as stepping into a cage with a lion or tiger. Clay looked at Joe's slim, straight figure, and then glanced over to where Jupiter and Sultan loomed powerful and dangerous in their cages. "But you carry a gun of some sort," Clay inquired anxiously. "Don't you?" Joe laughed. "I wear one of those new Colt repeating pistols, but it's loaded only with blanks. I couldn't afford to shoot up one of these costly animals if I wanted to. Oh yes, I carry that too." He nodded his sleek dark head toward a slender buggy whip that stood beside the poles. "You'll see. At most times, the whip is all I need." Clay drew a deep breath. This Joe Dobbin was the bravest man he'd ever hoped to meet. He picked up the whip and ran it through his closed hand to feel its limberness. Pa," he said. "To think, anyone can train lions with a whip lighter than the one we use for Lightfoot." "Not anybody," said Pa. "Some trainers use heavier whips. I've seen some carrying bull whips." Joe nodded. "And with the ends loaded with lead, too. A whip like that can cut the hide off a cat. Worse still, some lion trainers have braziers of hot coals kept handy, with irons heating in them all the time they're working in the cages. If the cats show fight or balk at a trick, the trainers try to force them by burning them with hot irons. A cowardly, brutal business, I'd call such methods of training a helpless critter," said Pa. "You're right, Hank," Joe said, his dark eyes flashing. "And it usually ends by turning the cats into killers if the trainer doesn't kill them first." "Seems I'd rather stake my chances on just being patient with them and kind," said Clay. "Like you do, Joe." "Thanks, Clay. I like to hear you say that," Joe answered. "Those old methods of training won't last forever. Trainers are learning that if they're only quick and watchful, and if the critter knows it'll be rewarded if it does its work right, the act usually goes through without any trouble." His eyes turned toward the door, where Ma was coming back with a gay patchwork quilt, and Emily was following with a small oval hooked rug. Quickly he went over to the bunk and stooped low to shove his rawhide trunk under it. "You've fixed things real snug for us," he said, straightening up to give Ma and Emily a pleased smile, while they spread the quilt over the bunk. His eyes glanced around the barn and cages, where all the animals were lying quiet. "I was afraid we'd be crowded, but now I'm thinking my pets and I will be right comfortable this winter here at High Ridge Farm." Chapter 4. No Cat Too Big for Catnip. After that, Clay spent every possible moment of every day in the barn helping Joe and getting acquainted with his pets. Joe wouldn't permit anyone but himself to feed the cats, but Clay carried water for them and fresh straw for their beds. He used a long-handled birch broom and pails of soapy warm water to swish out the cages. At these times the cats would leap up on the stools, of which there was one in every cage, and sit there glowering and sulky, for they dreaded getting their feet wet. At the end of the month of seeing Clay at work around their quarters every day, the animals became accustomed to him and accepted him almost as calmly as they did Joe. But to Clay, the exciting novelty of having them on the farm was ever new, and he guessed he would never get over the tiny feeling of fear that crawled along his nerves whenever he was working near Jupiter or Sultan. The leopards were the liveliest of the cats. They chased each other in rough and tumble game all day long. When they weren't wrestling and fighting with each other, they were looking around for someone else to pick on. One morning, Clay saw a spotted kitten climb the bars of Sultan's side of his cage to snarl and growl and spit at the big tiger. Sultan, stretched out in his cage, turned his fearsome head and lifted his lip in a lazy answering snarl. The leopard kitten let out a squall of fury and tore at the bars harder than ever with his sharp little claws. "Look at that," Clay chuckled. "The kitten thinks he's big enough to fight Sultan." "He would try to fight him if he could get at him," Joe replied. "He'd attack Sultan or Jupiter or any other beast except an elephant. That's what makes a leopard so dangerous. They are made of pure grit, without much sense. They're ready to fight the whole world. But they don't trust anyone, and they seldom make friends. Rusty happened to be walking by just then. He stopped a short distance from the door and cocked his head inquisitively as he smelled the alien beasts that had come to his farm. At the same time, a whiff of Rusty's scent reached the cats. All of them were interested, but the leopard kittens almost went crazy. Sultan was forgotten as the two of them scrambled to the front of their cage, snarling and meowing their intention of getting out and tearing that dog to bits. Rusty gave a single sharp woof and trotted calmly on his way to the sheep barn. Long after he was out of sight, the leopards continued to growl and tear at their cage bars. "They'd sure like to have Rusty for their supper," Clay said, scowling at the kittens. Joe laughed. "There's an old blood feud between leopards and dogs. The mere scent of a dog will drive any leopard in the world plumb daffy." After that, Clay didn't waste much time trying to win the friendship of the impish leopards. But Chaka was different. The lion cub seemed as good-natured as the leopards were snarly. He would watch Clay with keen curiosity whenever he worked about the barn. Joe had given the cubs a ball to play with, and sometimes when Clay was near his cage, Chaka would push the ball close to the bars, as if he were begging Clay to play with him. One icy, crisp afternoon in early winter, Clay carried a load of stove wood into the shed and found Joe shrugging into his caped greatcoat. "I'm riding to the village to inspect the horse and their quarters," Joe told him. "Will you take charge of things here until I return?" "You bet, Joe." Clay felt proud and warm inside to think Joe would entrust him with so much responsibility. He went to the door to watch Joe ride away on his prancy coal-black horse. Then Clay closed the door and filled the stove with fresh billets of wood. Chaka got up from the corner where he had been sleeping and padded to the front of his cage. He rubbed his tawny, sturdy body against the bars and uttered a coaxing little cry, halfway between a meow and a woof. Clay had often heard Joe talking cat back to the animals. He longed to try it for himself, but he had felt shy about attempting it while Joe was there. He walked over to Chaka's cage. "Meow, Chaka," he said, making his voice sound as much like a cat as possible. "Meow, yow, yow." Chaka's golden eyes sparkled with delight. Purrs came from him like steam from a tea kettle. Clay fetched a long stick to poke Chaka's ball about the cage. Chaka followed it boisterously, batting at it with his clumsy-looking paws. All the time, Clay kept up the cat talk, and sometimes Chaka would answer with a yow of his own. Clay kept standing closer and closer to the cage, until finally he was right up against the bars. Holding his breath, he put his hand inside and touched Chaka's head. The cub looked at him expectantly, so Clay dug his fingers into the fur between the young lion's ears and scratched gently. Chaka thought that was wonderful. He pushed his head up hard against Clay's hand, plainly asking for more. After a while, he rolled over on his back so Clay could scratch his fat, furry belly. "Why, you're no different than any old cat," Clay told him, while Chaka purred and purred. The time until Joe returned passed like magic. Clay found it hard to leave them, but there was a spelling lesson to be learned. He walked slowly up to the house. Ma was rolling out pies in the kitchen. A delicious fragrance of apples and cinnamon met Clay as he walked in. "Clay, will you run up to the attic and fetch me a string of dried pumpkin?" she asked. Tilly, from her place in the kitchen rocker, watched Clay open the door to the attic stairs. Like the other farm animals, Tilly was becoming used to the jungle cats at High Ridge, but she still feared and resented them. Neither she, nor the cows, nor the farm horses wanted anything to do with Clay after he had been in the lion barn, and the scent of the big cat still clung to his clothes. This afternoon, however, the lure of mouse hunting in the attic was stronger than Tilly's aversion to Clay. She pussyfooted after him while he climbed the steps. Strings of golden dried pumpkin rounds swung from the low attic rafters. While Clay was taking one down, the cat started clawing at some dried herbs hanging nearby. "What's that you're after, Puss?" "Oh, catnip." Clay pulled a sprig of the pungent herb and tossed it to her. She nibbled it eagerly and rubbed her face against the crushed leaves. "Say," Clay exclaimed, "I bet Chaka would like some of that." He jerked a larger sprig from one of the bunches of catnip that his mother had dried to use for medicinal tea. After he finished the spelling lesson, he went out and tossed the catnip into Chaga's cage. The cub just about had a fit. He pounced on it, bit at it greedily, and tossed it into the air. He lay down and rolled on it over and over and over. He played with it until he was exhausted. Then he sprawled happily on his back and went to sleep. By the time Clay and Joe were weak from laughing, Sultan and the lions and leopard kittens were crowding against the bars of their cages, sniffing the spicy fragrance of catnip and roaring their jealousy of Chaka. Clay hurried back to the attic for enough catnip to go around. When he came back with it, he said, "Tilly didn't know what a favor she was doing for her enemies when she hankered after this." "A favor for me too," said Joe. "I'm going to keep that Herbie handy after this as a special reward for all these big cats here." Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform and share our podcast with a friend. Visit our website at www.enchantedlibrary.net to see our past books or to connect with us on Facebook. If you'd like to support the work we do, you can visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/enchantedlibrary. We appreciate your support. Until next time, friends, happy reading.